next absolutely exciting instalment of our Leading Ladies journeys is looking into the life of the one and only Bri Davis, who is partner at Cooley Auctions here in the heart of Sydney. Cooley Auctions, many people will know, is one of the leading auction businesses in Australia, led by Damien Cooley. Bri holds the title of being probably the most recognisable and successful female auctioneer, not only here in New South Wales, but across Australia. She is a partner, as mentioned, and today she's going to share with us her incredible story of how she managed to find herself working in this amazing, amazing career. Thank you, Bri. Lovely to see you.
Thank you for having me. It's an absolute honour.
Okay, before we get into your story, I think it's so important for us to talk about the position that you hold as a partner at Cooley Auctions. Just before we go into the full story, how did that come to be?
I suppose I've been offered that role this year and stepped into that after having a year off from Cooley's. I was at Cooley's for 9 years and took a sidestep last year and went and worked for another franchise. Stepped back in as partner this year, and I think it is probably more of a recognition of my loyalty to the business and also, I suppose, just helping with any decision-making processes within the business as well. So, and being a leader within our team also.
That's so good. So we're going to talk today about your story, your history, but also, you know, I mentioned your status within the industry being a female auctioneer, and one that is really, you're breathing some rarefied air. There's not a lot.
Not a lot of us.
And so I think in your story today, it'd be amazing to unpack why that is and some of the challenges that you no doubt have had to overcome to get into the situation and status that you hold. But before we do that, I'd like to go back and talk about your history and your childhood and what interests you had as a kid. And I think it's so relevant because it's definitely informed your later career choices.
Yeah, absolutely. I think as a young child, I was always interested in the performing arts, and I grew up doing speech and drama and dance and being on stage, and I really enjoyed that and doing those performances. So I think that led me into having an ability and confidence when it came to public speaking, which is a huge thing that you need as an auctioneer, obviously. And I think that performing side of it really helps when you're stepping into the role of as an auctioneer, because you are getting up and essentially doing, you know, we quite often refer to it as street performance, especially when we're on the street auctioning for a crowd. So I think that passion that I had growing up has sort of led me into and formulated, you know, the basics of where I've become.
So when you're a kid, drama, public speaking, your ambition perhaps was not to be an auctioneer?
No, I think when I was 5 or 6, I wanted to be a Hollywood actress.
Yeah, sounds good.
Didn't make it. Yeah. But this is probably the next best thing.
Yeah. So what was that course like for you going through, you know, obviously through school, you did drama, you mentioned the public speaking part.
Yes. So I did a lot of Eisteddfods, which was, you know, I suppose reciting poetry and doing monologues and a lot of drama. So I grew up doing that. My mum is actually still involved in the Northern Beaches Eisteddfod.
Oh, wow.
She's got my boys involved in it this year. So there's a lot of passion, I suppose, on our side for that performance. But I think just going in and being able to do that, I then wanted to, when I sort of realised that Hollywood actress was probably a little bit out of the question, I think I wanted to get into the television space here in Sydney or in Australia, in the Australian TV film industry. And I went and did a Bachelor of Arts in Media and Communication at UNSW, did that for 3 years and ended up in a role in SBS for 6 months.
Wow.
And that was where I sort of edged my way into that space, thinking, okay, do I want to perhaps be a television presenter or, you know, have that role, or perhaps even on the production side be a producer? And after about 6 months there, I realised that wasn't probably what it was all shown to be, and I wasn't no longer interested in pursuing that sort of a career.
I mean, that would have been probably quite hard to even get that entry-level role. There's not a whole heap of jobs going
No.
At SBS or other television stations. What was that work that you did for that first 6 months?
So that first 6 months, it was very exciting. I was working in the tapes library. I don't even know if that's around anymore, but working in the tapes library at SBS. So it wasn't the most glamorous role or most exciting role, but I think it gave me a good insight to what that actual industry was all about. And I think, knowing it was all contract based and you're not sort of in that normal 9 to 5 time frame. It's, you could be on set until 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning. I sort of quite quickly realised that it wasn't going to be the career path that I had in mind for myself.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned, you noticed that most of the people who were getting those roles as presenting or hosting shows, they actually were already well known. They had their own profile. So you're kind of coming straight out of a green space and you just felt like it was
going to be pretty hard for me to crack into that sort of a role.
And so your next passion was real estate.
It was.
So you were a child who loved real estate growing up? Yeah.
I actually, funnily enough, I was going through some things in my room the other day and I pulled out in, I think year 7, we put a time capsule in at one of our school camps and we had to write a letter to our year 12 self. So we'd pull it out in year 12. And in year 12, I read the letter and it said, I hope that you're either a doctor, an actress, or a real estate agent. So I obviously knew in year 7 that maybe one of those things I might end up in. And so funnily enough, I did actually decide to look at getting into real estate, wanting that sales career. And that's where I started sort of venturing into that side of things.
And so what was that early real estate work? What did you do?
So I was an PA to a director of an office nearby in my local area. And I think that gave me a really solid foundation into understanding the complexities and everything there is to know about real estate. We were there from the cold calls, from drawing up a contract, being on the auction floor and watching how he operated and how the auctioneer operated as well, to putting deals together, negotiations. So it gave me a really good understanding and an appreciation of the entire process from sort of woe to go. And I think it gave me a real leg up when it came to actually becoming an auctioneer, is having known, how to do up a contract, how to have those negotiations, those tough, conversations with vendors and purchasers as well.
So that was a few years that you did that role, working as, like the right hand to the director of the business. So many people at that point would have decided to go and become an agent. Well, why do you think you didn't choose that route?
I think at that time I was probably in my mid-20s, thinking at some point in the next few years I would like to start a family. And I knew that, I was watching all my colleagues and me myself with my boss at the time, we were in living rooms until 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, most days of the week. And I thought, I didn't really want to put myself in that position when I'm trying to start a family or having a young family. I wanted something that was a little bit more flexible, and I also didn't want to, I suppose, start as a sales agent, working my way up and building up my pipeline and my database, and then sort of put it on hold for when I was raising my kids. So that's when I started looking at, okay, what are some other options that I can do? I've got a passion for real estate. What can I do that gives me a little bit more flexibility around having a young family? And it's not to say that I won't look at a sales career later down the track. It may be on the cards, who knows? But while I was raising a young family, I just really did want to have that sort of more of a work-life balance and that flexibility.
And you mentioned you had exposure. The business you were working in, they were an auction office. They conducted auctions, so you got to see the whole process.
Yes, yeah.
Were there any role models for you at that time? Were there any female role models that you could look up to say, oh yeah, okay, it is possible for me? Like, when did you first get that idea of becoming an auctioneer?
The first idea of becoming an auctioneer was actually when I did the real estate license course and we had to do our auctioneers, or we elected to do our auctioneers accreditation. And I was sitting there in a room full of people and I watched everybody else that was in the same boat as me get up, and we had to conduct a pretend auction, and they were all standing there with their pieces of paper shaking. And I was actually one of the last ones. So by the time I got up there and having that speech and drama background, I'd almost memorised the script. So I got up there and was relatively confident and did it without being nervous. And the trainer at the time said to me, have you ever thought about doing this? And I said, no, never. He said, you really should. And so I went back to my boss at the time and told him, I said, look, I did actually enjoy it, and I think it's something that maybe I could do. I didn't know of any other female auctioneers at the time, because all the auctioneers that we'd had in our business had all been male. And he said, right, there's the REI's got a novice comp. It's in about 3 weeks. I'm entering you. You're going to do that and see how you go.
Wow.
And so I was sort of thrown in the deep end
So
within
your boss
3 weeks.
did that to you?
He did that,
Okay.
yeah. So it was
you.
such,
Not to you.
Yeah, to me. Well, almost to me. I was thinking, oh gosh, okay, what am I in for?
Yeah.
But it was such a good push in the right direction. He was incredibly supportive.
Yep.
He was amazing and really, got me in the office practicing in front of everybody and really threw me in there. And I ended up winning the Northern Beaches heat and went on to the final. And at that time, I think there was about 20 of us in the final, and I was the only female.
Wow.
Only female. And the only other female auctioneer that I'd heard of at that time was actually Kate Lumby. I'm not sure if she was still auctioning, because I know that she's got a sales business now as well. But I suppose she was one person that I would, do a bit of research on and look up to. But it is refreshing to see a lot more coming through the ranks now.
So at that point, you're in the novice finals. There's 20 auctioneers and you're one woman of 20. At that point, did that fact, was it really obvious to you? Was it something that you noticed and you thought maybe was an advantage or a disadvantage, or not so much?
I didn't really think of it at the time, but I think other people probably noticed it more so. I mean, for me, I just thought, okay, I'm just competing against other auctioneers. I didn't really worry whether they were male or female. I think as I started my career, it's become more of a thing. Oh, female auctioneer, oh, she's a young female. So I think that's how people categorise us.
Yes.
But at the end of the day, I thought about this the other day. I thought, there's sales agents, there's male and female sales agents. When you're comparing those, you're not really saying, okay, there's a male sales agent and a female sales agent.
Yeah.
There's just agents.
I was having a conversation with a young female auctioneer today, and we were talking about how it is kind of one of the last bastions of real gender stereotyping. Like it's sort of, I think there's a lot of, this young female auctioneer was working in an agency where her principal didn't support her ambition to become an auctioneer, which meant she ended up moving on from that role. He was very supportive of her development in lots of other areas, but it was just like,
Why would you?
not even overt, not saying you couldn't do it, but just didn't support it.
Okay.
So it is interesting, isn't it, that prefix of the word female seems to be necessary in the definition of your role description. So you've done the novice comp, but you're still working as an associate to the director of the business, but you're now qualified. You've had a taste of competition. You've had some success. What's your next step?
So at the final, at the auction final, my boss at the time introduced me to Damien Cooley, and he said, make sure you don't steal her. But he said, I'd love for you to support her and give her some training. So I ended up meeting up with Damien. We did a few training sessions together, and I also he invited me to spend a few Saturdays in his car with him. So when I wasn't working for my boss doing open homes, it was a little bit quieter, then I'd jump in the car with Damien every chance I could and just watch him, how he interacted, how he called it, just learn everything, I suppose, that he would do. And I think towards the end of that year, it started to get busy, and he said to me, look, Bri, we've got some auctions that we need covering, help covering. Would you like to call some? I said, yes, absolutely. So I think that's how it all started from there.
Amazing. So you weren't calling auctions for the business that you were working in, but you did, just through that relationship and your apprenticeship, if you like, with Damien. Yep. He saw potential in you, and he started to actually give you some auctions.
Yes, that's right. And then I said to my boss at the real estate office, I said, next year I'd really like to focus on doing auctions on Saturdays. So I understand if that means I can't stay on with you as your assistant. However, if there's an opportunity for me to do Monday to Friday and then me do auctions on Saturday, I'd love that. And so he was happy to work around that, keep me Monday to Friday. I was his Monday to Friday assistant. He had somebody else helping him with weekends, and then I went and did called Auctions for Coolies.
So I'd love for you to talk about those first, I'm sure you remember your first auction.
Yeah, absolutely.
How nerve-wracking was that, your first auction?
Very, very nerve-wracking.
Yeah. What were you most nervous about?
Um,
Because you're a performer.
Yeah, so it wasn't, I think, it was a mortgagee in possession sale, and it was right on the beachfront at Collaroy, which was near where I lived. So I'd told a few people by this stage that I was doing it. So I had my parents there, my partner, his parents there. There was people in the crowd, but I had so many people there. And I think just because it was, it was your first proper auction that you're calling, as soon as I started talking, my mouth went completely dry.
Yeah.
And it was a good auction. It ended up, thankfully, going really well and flew past the reserve, and we ended up selling it. But I think it was just fear of the unknown, not knowing, and that's with every auction. You never know how it's going to pan out. So I think just not knowing how it was going to go, making sure I said the right things, and I think I've said to every auctioneer that's sort of come in, I said, your first auction's always going to be your hardest.
Yeah.
Once you've done that, it'll be, much easier from there.
Yeah, it's an uncomfortable skill to learn in the beginning. Yeah. And obviously you mentioned that those initial auctions, they were handed to you through Damien, which was great. So you had that referral network. Yeah. How did you find overcoming, we've spoken about the inherent bias that auctioneering is typically a male role.
Yes.
How did you go with those first few clients that you called for? How much of an issue was it? How did you overcome it? What were the things that you did to empower yourself?
I remember I had called a few auctions and I ended up getting booked in it was actually a female agent of all things, getting booked in for a female agent. And when I called her just, to see how the auction was shaping up for the weekend, she said, are you calling it? Oh, I didn't think you were calling it. She said, have you called many auctions before? And I said, yes, I have. And I thankfully called a really good one for one of her colleagues the week before. I said, I actually did one last weekend. She said, oh, that was a really good auction. Oh, okay. And then after I'd called her auction and she was happy, she booked me from then on. But it was just overcoming, I suppose, being unknown and being female and being young at the time. It was, I suppose it was more the agents overcoming that.
Yeah.
I think a lot of agents that were probably really confident, high-performing agents, to be honest, they didn't really have much of an issue. It was more the ones that were a little bit more, probably weren't as good, weren't as confident, that because they were worried what the vendors were probably going to think or how it would portray them. But the other ones, and a lot of the time Damien would say, he'd support me and have my back and say, made you trust me? Yes, I promise you she's going to do a good job for you.
Yeah.
So having that really helped, really helped my career.
And how about because obviously the first time many auctioneers will meet the vendors is at the auction day itself. How about those, initial meetings of did you have any vendors who were surprised to see a woman or, perhaps treated you in a way that was less than ideal early days?
I actually, at one point I had a male assistant. So we take an assistant to all of our auctions, and I had a guy that was working with me, and he ended up wearing, because Cooley auctioneers have the Cooley tie, but obviously being a female, I didn't have anything that was coolified. So he wore the female tie, and more often than not, people would go up to shake his hand thinking he was the auctioneer.
Yeah.
I said, oh no, it's actually me.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it might have got them a bit nervous, especially when I meet somebody. I'm not that really outspoken, very vocal, a loud person. But when I start my auction, it's almost like I've got an alter ego, and they sort of say to you after, "Oh wow, you're actually really loud. You're very confident up there." So, so it was funny.
So once you proved yourself, you started to build, and that's what happens, right?
Yeah.
You become an extension of that agent's business.
Yes.
So you mentioned you were young. How old were you when you really started? Actually, you were on the books for Cooley Auctions. How old were you then?
I would have been probably 26, I'd say.
Okay.
26.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you're having to kind of go in there. You made a comment to me when we spoke last week about confidence and about portraying, like you were really aware of the fact that you had these sort of hurdles that you would have to overcome, and so you had to overcome them with confidence. How would you get yourself in the right mindset for that?
I think just knowing that I could do it, knowing in myself that you've done this before. I suppose knowledge is power. So knowing as much as you could about the property, about the agent, about the situation, about the location, about the buyers and how it was going to play out, I think that would give you the confidence to know, because in an auction we really never know what's going to happen. You could have 10 bidders but none of them could bid, so it's just knowing as much as you possibly could before you stepped in there and before you started calling it. I think that is what gave me confidence each time.
So how long did it take from that point where you've told your boss, don't count on me on Saturdays anymore, I'm an auctioneer, you start getting some bookings, how long did it take before that became your main role?
Yeah. It was about 6 months after, so sort of midway through the year, a job came up at Cooley's where it was essentially the auction manager. And I called Damien and I said, hey, do you think this is something that I could do? I think, it would make sense for me to be more ingrained in the business because that's what I want to do. And I wasn't like I was letting my other boss down, but I did feel bad that I wasn't available on Saturdays if it was busy, and I sort of thought at the time, he could get somebody that really could be there all the time. And so that popped up and Damien ended up saying, well, I think you'd be perfect for it. And soon after I started in that role. And so then that was Monday to Friday with auctions on Saturdays. And I think that really actually catapulted my career. Because I was on the phone to all the agents, the assistants, booking auctions, and being, the first person that they spoke to or that they saw when they came into the office. So I was there for all of the in-room auctions as well, meeting them, chatting to them. I was watching as many auctions as I possibly could. So I think that really helped my career.
You accelerated the relationship part.
Absolutely.
And so how long did you do that coordinator role?
So that was, I think it would have been it was probably only about 18 months until I went on maternity leave with my first child. So it was only about 18 months, but it was such a great time. It was such a great role for me.
And so so that was the plan, right? This is why you chose auctioneering, because you knew you and your husband wanted to start a family. That was definitely your road, career and motherhood. And so at the time that you went, 18 months later, you went on maternity leave with your first child. How many auctions were you calling a week at that point?
It was probably on average, what I've been doing, like 10 to 15 auctions a week, I'd say. He was actually born in spring, in September, so it was possibly a few more. I remember being about 38 weeks pregnant and Damien couldn't do the Cooley night. He said, can you do it? And there was about 15 auctions. I waddled up there and called.
Let's hope this doesn't induce labour.
So, it could have been even more than that. It might have been 20 plus auctions a week then.
Wow. And so, I made the comment to you, one of the things that in the Leading Ladies fraternity, one of the topics that we talk about often is baby management. How do I fit in getting pregnant, having a baby, when do I come back? And you had a pretty short gap before you came back.
Pretty short maternity leave.
How many weeks?
I was back calling auctions 2 weeks after I gave birth.
But that was your choice.
It was my choice, absolutely. And it was tricky, especially with the first, the second and third, I sort of thought, okay, no, I've done this before. I know I can go back 2 weeks later. But it was pretty ambitious of me, I think, looking back now, saying, yeah, it'll be fine. I'll come back 2 weeks later. One of the guys in the office who's got 3 kids, he said, are you sure? You don't know what it's going to be like. I said, no, it'll be fine. If I tell myself that that's when I'm doing it, I will make it work. It's fine.
And the fortunate thing about the role choice was that it was pretty well confined to Saturdays. And a little bit, there might be a couple of evening auctions.
That's it.
So that was actually a very smart choice on your behalf, because you really gave yourself space. You didn't kind of consult your husband too much that you were going back after 2 weeks. He just had to deal with it.
He said, here's the baby. There's the bottles.
Work it out.
Figure it out.
Wow.
So, but it was, and for me, I think I said this to you the other day, it was so nice to step back into that role and actually leave, the nappies and all of that sleep deprivation behind and put a face on and put some clothes on and go out and speak to adults and my clients who, after so many years I've have become good friends as well. So it was almost like I was having a day out, a day off. I actually do refer to Saturdays as my day off. Even that's why.
Because you're now a mother of three.
That's my full-time job, yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah.
You know, my family's in Adelaide. I'm in Sydney. I'm having a great time
yeah.
now because no, I love
we love them. We love them.
Yeah, it's nice to have the balance.
Yeah.
And so, but you know, because your career was growing, like you mentioned, that having a baby didn't slow your career down at all.
Yeah.
It just kept
I was very
going.
fortunate, you know, obviously being in that auction space with, you know, I couldn't have gone back to a, you know, Monday to Friday full-on role, you know, at 2 weeks. And I was just lucky that I had chosen this career path that I could go and do 1 day a week, and it wouldn't always be a full day. I might have gaps in the day, or it might, you know, I might have auctions that didn't go ahead in the afternoon or the morning. So it was not always, you know, a full jam-packed day. So that was really lucky for me as well.
And so you mentioned in those early days, but well, before you went on mat leave, you were doing somewhere between 15 and 20 auctions a week, and then it kept building. And you built to sort of like 400 auctions in a year?
Yeah, about 350, 400 a year on average. I mean, obviously it's very seasonal, so there's been years that have been busier than others.
Yeah.
But sort of around that sort of average.
And so 3 kids. Was that always the plan to have 3?
I'd always said 3 or 4 would
Yeah.
be my ideal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how far apart are your children?
2 years, basically.
Okay. Yeah, right.
So very close.
And you said each time you did a 2-week gap and went back to work.
Yes. Well, my youngest was 18th of January, so it might have been 3 weeks by the time we sort of rolled into February. Because obviously with auctioneers we have pretty much from Christmas time until early mid-February. Giving the agents time to sort of start the campaigns.
Yes.
But yeah, it was about 2 or 3 weeks most time.
Yeah, well, so you know, you strategically timed.
Yeah, almost.
Yeah,
You'd say that.
Mine too. So you did mention at the start of our conversation that you did take a change. You decided to try a different brand and a different opportunity. Do you mind sharing what was behind that decision?
I suppose I'd been with Cooley's for 9 years at the time, and it was. Don't get me wrong, such a hard decision. I think having a seed planted in my head, and it was also about location. So most of my clients at Cooley's have sort of been city east, inner west over this pocket, and I live on the northern beaches, which isn't too far. But when I looked at this other career move, it was going to be more focused on where I lived, which I thought would have made a little bit more sense and would have been a little bit easier when it came to travelling and the logistics of things as well. So I did that for 12 months and ended up meeting some fabulous people and amazing agents and forming great friendships as well. But I think I was always sort of drawn back to Cooley's, and having, I think, the possibilities at Cooley's I realised were far greater than this, and I soon realised that it wasn't all about the logistics, it was about, the potential and where I was most happy.
Yeah, and so you've come back and you have got this partner title, which you said is a recognition of your loyalty. You know, you've obviously done the job from the ground up. Like you've been the person on the phones, taking the bookings, helping at in-room events, through to being the auctioneer and a senior member of the team now. You're obviously now working in more of a leadership space in the company. What is it that you enjoy about being a senior member?
I suppose just being consulted for decisions that are made throughout the business. And I think that would be the main thing, is just sort of, like being asked the question when it comes to decisions. Yeah.
I know you've done a little bit of mentoring, particularly with young women who want to get into auctioneering. Something that you divulged to me was that you are actually, luckily, you're pretty good at maths. So you were doubly gifted because you had the dramatic and the ability to do public speaking, and you also are pretty good with the numbers. If I was coming to you, I'm a brand new person, I want to get into auctioneering, what are the things that you would recommend that I work on first? What are the core skills?
I suppose it would depend on what you're good at to start with. But you definitely need to be confident getting up and speaking. I think that would be a good thing. I think obviously the maths, but that's more so for the competitions, I think, where they throw some crazy numbers at you. Most of the time on Saturdays, the buyers are pretty nice.
Numbers aren't too hard.
They're not too bad. But I think it would be really understanding, like if you were coming in and wanting to become an auctioneer, I think you really need to understand how the whole sales process works. You really need to get an understanding of if you need to stay back and help an agent execute a contract, you're the person, even though they do it more than you do it, executing contracts, they will look to you for any advice, or can we do this? Knowing the ins and outs of the process, what you need for what buyers would need for a registration to register, what they would need if they're bidding on behalf of another person or a company, because I've got top performing agents that still call me and say, just checking, I've got this buyer and this is the situation, what do they need? And so just knowing that and being the go-to person for all their questions when it comes to auctioning.
So inform yourself, keep learning.
Absolutely.
Because, know the legislation. Because the auctioneer is seen as the most senior person at the auction. So you need to have the answers. But you also made a comment there, I suppose, about being humble and being willing to help. If you need to help them fill in a contract, you help them fill in a contract.
Absolutely. I think over-servicing any of your agents it's just seen to be such a great thing to have. I've got agents that don't want me to step off the auction floor and help with any negotiations, and then I've got agents that I'll step off the auction floor and go and help them with the negotiations. So it's just asking the question of your agents, what do you want? What do you want as an auctioneer? What would you like from me? I'm available to do whatever you like, as much or as little as you like. Just knowing what they need from you, and reminding yourself that you're an extension of them when it comes to the auction. You're a representation of their brand as well. So just bearing that in mind all the time.
Being flexible.
Also, absolutely.
That's great advice. It feels like auctioneering was a very natural fit, but I'm wondering what was the most challenging part for you to overcome as you were growing your skill set in the early days?
I think learning the patter, learning the call, because when I did the novice comp, I'd never actually called an auction. So I got up there and I remember the judge at the time saying, "You're a bit too theatrical," which is fair considering my background. But then I sort of realised, okay, there's a little bit of an art to the patter and the call, and I suppose changing it up. I think I still struggle. You've got a script in your head and you know it's second nature. I'm like, okay, these poor agents have heard me say the same thing so many times. Like let's sort of change it up, and just making sure that you're sort of always keeping fresh. I know my husband, who's also an auctioneer, he's from time to time just pulling out the notebook and, that's a good line, I can use that one there, you've got to keep it fresh. Okay, so if I was a young auctioneer and looking to start, what would be, I know you've given me some advice there, but about building a client base, how would you go about that? I think just like anything with prospecting, it's just getting on the phones, getting out there, going to as many auctions as you can to keep upskilling your craft. I still go, if I've got a gap on my Saturday, I still go and watch other auctioneers, mainly to just sort of, so as your husband says, okay, that's a great line. What can you do? You're sort of reading different situations as well and seeing how different auctioneers handle it. But I think, going to as many industry events as you can. It's all about networking, really. And obviously just giving them great service is the main thing, because if you do a good job, they're going to want to book you again.
100%. What's the most extreme thing that's happened at an auction? Like, what's the most surprising, or I'm just throwing you on the spot here. I mean, I've got some very funny stories, but there's sometimes things that happen you don't expect, and you've got to think on your feet.
Gosh, I'm just thinking, I mean, this isn't really something that was too extreme, but I'm just thinking back to COVID when we were doing them all online and we had the live stream. I couldn't see any of the buyers because we were doing it through Realtor. And I had this one auction that was a dilapidated terrace in Balmain, and most auctions on average would probably go for about 15 minutes or so, give or take. This one I think went for an hour and a half because they just weren't stopping. They weren't stopping, and it got down to, most of the time I would not take $1,000 bids unless I knew that we'd really reached our limit. But we were well over reserve, and they ended up throwing in, and it was hard at the time having to not be able to see them and talk to them. There was a delay, and if they're putting through $1,000 bid on the iPad, it'd take a lot more time for us to go, no, it needs to be 5 or it needs to be 10, than to sort of just take it and move on and roll with it. And this auction, I can't even think of how many $1,000 bids we had, but it went on for an hour and a half. I almost needed an intermission. It was that long. So I think just having those moments, whereas at the start of COVID, we would struggle to even get a bid.
Yeah.
It was tricky. Yeah. But sort of watching how it shifted and watching how it evolved, and just, even now having the hybrid auctions where you've got some online bidders and then some in the room, it's, I think they're tricky. But
hybrid
keeping you on your
tough.
toes.
Yeah. So now you're a mum of 3. How old are your children now, Brie?
So they're 4, 6 and 8.
Wow, it's such a busy time.
Yes, in the trenches.
What's next for you?
I think next is just, I really want to grow my numbers, really get back and focus on. I was quite fortunate in the beginning where I didn't really have to prospect much because I was in that role, and the auctions did come to me almost handed. I don't want to say handed to me on a silver platter, but a lot of the time I was very fortunate with the relationships I built. But I think just going to that next step and just growing as much as I can possibly, and doing as many auctions as I possibly can.
What if you could go back and give 2013 Brie some advice on how to really dominate in this role, what advice would you give your younger self?
I think it would be just get involved as much as you possibly could, whether it was the comps. I mean, I did get involved in the comps, but just being confident to go into the comps, doing as many as you could, going to as many events as you could, picking up the phone, just being really ingrained and involved. And I think pre-2013 it would have been get your real estate license as soon as you leave school.
Yeah.
Because it's such a
don't
great
waste
thing.
any time.
My kids are like, as soon as you leave school, whether you're at uni, get your real estate license.
Yeah, so you'll have 3 junior auctioneers.
Yeah, that's absolutely. I might start Davis Auctions.
You heard it here, folks. Who's the natural auctioneer out of your kids?
Oh, it'd be the eldest, the 8-year-old. Although I wouldn't put it past the 4-year-old. He could probably, he gets my gavel in the back of the car and starts just slow down.
What's something that we might not know about you? Something surprising?
Something surprising. Well, I became a pretty good yodeler when I was doing my Europe trip in, was it 2009?
Does it ever find its way into an auction?
Not an auction, no. But quite often if I go out with my girlfriends that we went travelling with, I might get a little yodel out.
Can we get a yodel, Brie? I'm so sorry.
Oh gosh, okay. High on the hill with a lonely goat, yodel, yodel, yodel.
I love it. That's so good. Brie, it has been an absolute delight talking to you. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to see what you do next.
Oh, exciting.
Thank you.
You.
It's great.